let people settle down, and then we'll get started. Thank you. Good evening and welcome to the 14th India and the World webinar series hosted by Carnegie India. Analysts and commentators in India are in broad agreement that the June 15 Galwan Valley incident, which led to the first fatalities at the line of actual control in 45 years, marks an inexorable decline in India-China ties. In his new paper, The Road from Galwan, The Future of India-China Relations, Vijay Gokhale argues that the unprecedented violence at the border was not as unforeseen as we might expect, but rather a culmination of growing misperceptions and mistrust between the two Asian giants dating back over a decade. Mapping Sino-Indian relations across three distinct phases, Vijay Gokhale's paper provides both a historical as well as a forward-looking perspective on Sino-Indian relations and how they reached this breaking point, and perhaps much more importantly, what the road ahead looks like. To examine these emerging complexities of a fraught and fragile Sino-Indian relationship, as explored in his latest paper, we're honored to have with us today the author, Ambassador Vijay Gokhale, and Professor Srinath Raghavan to offer his reflections on the paper. Mr. Vijay Gokhale is a non-resident senior fellow at Carnegie India. Mr. Gokhale retired from the Indian Foreign Service in January 2020 after a diplomatic career that spanned 39 years. From January 2018 to January 2020, he served as the Foreign Secretary of India. Prior to his term as Foreign Secretary, Mr. Gokhale has served as India's High Commissioner to Malaysia, Ambassador to Germany, and Ambassador to the People's Republic of China from January 2016 to October 2017, beg your pardon. He has served as head of the India Taipei Association in Taiwan from July 2003 to 2007. During his time in the headquarters of the Ministry of External Affairs, he has also worked in key positions in the East Asia Division, including as the Joint Secretary for East Asia from March 2007 to December 2009. He is currently also a distinguished physical faculty at the Rashtriya Raksha University in Gujarat. Srinath Raghavan is a non-resident senior fellow at Carnegie India also. He's also a professor of international relations and history at Ashoka University. His primary research focus is on the contemporary and historical aspects of India's foreign and security policies. He's written a range of books, perhaps a few too many to recount here. But it's suffice to say that I think Srinath has almost single-handedly built out a new genre of study in India, of post-1947 modern India. He was awarded the K. Subramaniam Prize for his outstanding contribution to strategic studies in 2011 and the Infosys Prize in Social Sciences in 2015. He's been a member of the National Security Advisory Board. He was the chief editor of the Kargil War History for the Indian Ministry of Defense. And prior to entering academia, he spent 6 years as an infantry officer in the Indian Army. A few housekeeping points before we get started today. We have over 400 people who have registered for the seminar. Many will be on this particular call. Many will log in through YouTube and Twitter and what have you. Unfortunately, we won't have the time for voice questions. But if you do have questions and comments, please add them to the chat box on Zoom or on YouTube or on Twitter, and I will relay them to our speakers. We thought of dividing the session up into 3 parts. In the first, I'll ask Ambassador Gokhale to walk us through his thesis of perception and misperception that underlies the thread of argument, perhaps, on his working paper on India and China. I'll ask Srinath then to provide a few reflection and then dive straight into interactions and questions. So without any further delay, please turn to Ambassador Vijay Gokhale.
Thank you, Rudra. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great privilege for me to um, talk to all of you on this webinar, and I want to thank Carnegie for publishing my working paper and for all the people in Carnegie who helped me along with it. I thought the paper was topical because of the events that happened in 2020. And I think there is a fairly widespread agreement that it led to serious damage in India-China relations. Now, there has been some positive development since February. The process of disengagement has begun in some areas. And I think there is cautious optimism that it will continue and also hopefully lead to a broader de-escalation of forces. So at some stage, perhaps within this year, both governments have to now look forward to rebuilding that relationship. And the real objective of the paper was to see if we could discern what were the causes or the factors for the deterioration of the relationship. Just a word on methodology. I consciously felt that we should listen to voices from China and India, although there is excellent writing on India-China relations by third parties, principally because I wanted to understand how the academic and strategic community in these two countries saw that relationship. I also felt that one had to have a cutoff year, and I selected the year 2008 because the global financial crisis was in one sense a watershed. It was the time when China really came out into the world because it not only pulled its own economy out of the doldrums, it was a significant engine of growth for the rest of the world. And for India as well, after many years of fairly rapid economic growth and very positive developments in our relationship with all the major countries, we were in a good place in terms of foreign policy. And that's why I selected the period of 2008 to 2020 to look at the issue. As my paper explains, I looked at it from three perspectives. One could have taken more perspectives, but I limited myself to three. The first, of course, being whether in the course of the readjustment or the reworking of foreign policy that took place, whether India and China gave enough importance or put the other country in a proper place in forming this new approach. Secondly, whether the strong governments that took office in China in 2012 and in India in 2014 had any bearing on the relationship in terms of the deterioration in the relationship. And lastly, of course, was the US factor. So far as the first perspective was concerned, I think it's fair to say that both India and China by 2008 were reworking their foreign policies after a sustained period of economic growth and of consequent growth in their influence in the world as well. I think it's also fair to say that governments in India have generally given a prominent place to China in the making of India's foreign policy. All Indian governments have considered China to be a major country. And while biases exist because of events that transpired in 1962 and maybe thereafter, the fact remains that in the making of Indian foreign policy, China is given a place of importance, and therefore what might or might not impact on them does actually get factored into policy. I tried to examine, therefore, whether a similar approach was taken by China. And after a lot of reading, I came to the conclusion that China actually approached the reworking of its foreign policy rather differently. By 2008 or 2009, although it had not yet reached $10 trillion in terms of GDP, and it was still militarily not the China of today, but it had already perhaps decided to create a new framework in which it felt that if it was not equal to the United States, it was at least the number 2 power, and that Russia had slipped to number 3. So in a sense, their reworking of foreign policy was in terms of major power relations and the framework of major power relations. And although China talked the language of multipolarity, the underlying sense that I got was that essentially they looked at the United States themselves, that is China, Russia, and the European Union as the 4 poles, as it were. Occasionally, there was mention of Japan and India, of course, but more than that, India was mentioned as a developing country or as an emerging economy or as a neighboring country. So my own sense was that they did not give any sort, or they chose not to give a proper position to India. And therefore, there was no assumption that India might respond in any particular way to their policies. And therefore, when India did respond to their policies, wherever it impinged on Indian interests, the Chinese could not correctly read the Indian response. This is my view. The second perspective was, of course, the strong leaderships in both countries. And there is no gainsaying that President Xi in China, after he was appointed as the president in March 2013, has taken a fairly robust view of foreign policy. And of course, Prime Minister Modi, after he took office in 2014, has also advanced India's foreign policy goals. Now, as far as India is concerned, of course, what needed to be recognized by the Chinese side and was perhaps not recognized, at least not immediately, was that for the first time we had a majority government in office. Since the meeting between Deng Xiaoping and Rajiv Gandhi, on the basis of which the relationship moved forward, India had never had a single party majority government. They were all coalition governments. So in a sense, China was used to dealing with coalition governments, which have a very different internal dynamic to a government which does not depend on other parties for its position in power. And perhaps this was one area where a better judgment might have helped. Nonetheless, of course, from India's perspective, while the foreign policy was more robust in terms of neighborhood first policy and so on, very early on, the government of Prime Minister Modi engaged with the Chinese, first in Ahmedabad and then in Xi'an. And there was an attempt to give prominence to China in terms of Indian foreign policy and to understand where China was going under its new leadership. So I think that perhaps instead of recognizing that a foreign policy might become more robust and even more assertive under a single party government, the Chinese tended to attribute political motives in terms of the orientation of the government, that it was a right-wing government, that it was a nationalist government. Now, this might partly be because of the way in which the Communist Party thinks about other countries in terms of parties, but I haven't gone into that aspect. Nonetheless, I think there was some amount of misperception there, certainly misjudgment there, on what really was the foreign policy under Prime Minister Modi. And they tended to ignore such initiatives, for instance, as the informal summits or other initiatives where the Prime Minister was willing to talk with the leadership of China in a fairly open fashion on where the relationship was going. On the Chinese side, of course, President Xi came in with a global agenda because that's the way foreign policy had been framed just before he took office. And obviously, many of his policies were global, like the Belt and Road. And perhaps in India, we needed to better understand that this was a global policy. It was not an India-specific policy. On the other hand, however, it's a little difficult to believe that making the China-Pakistan economic corridor as a flagship project. A month before President Xi received Prime Minister Modi in Xi'an would not, in their own minds, alert them to the fact that India would react in some way. And if in fact this was not, the top leadership was not aware, then perhaps this was a failing in their academic community and perhaps in their decision making, in their policy community, that they did not sensitize the leadership to this fact. But this clearly may also have been a perception from the Chinese side about India simply being willing to accept this, because after all, work between China and Pakistan had been going on for many years, and that they perhaps presumed India would not react. Similarly, issues like blocking India in the nuclear suppliers group or blocking the listing of Masood Azhar might have appeared small from their perspective. But from our perspective, these were important issues. And here again, there was a difference in the identity perception. Now, China might well have argued that there were other countries opposing India in the NSG as well. Or, well, of course, in Masood Azhar, there was no other country. But that is an argument I find to be specious because, for instance, merely because other countries were opposing China's membership of the United Nations in the 1950s, should India not have supported China in that regard? So this is a specious argument. And here again, it was an identity misperception, presumably, or perhaps because the framework they had drawn up didn't place India as a major power. And therefore, they felt that they could have a different approach to India, or that India's reaction might not be something which would be very germane to their foreign policy. And therefore, there was a certain deafness to India's requests or India's, and a certain insensitivity to India's requirements in that period. And I think this added to the misperception on both sides. The third factor, of course, is the United States, and they have been the elephant in the room right from 1947 and 1949. But I think 2008 was the turning point because of the 1-2-3 nuclear deal. And because some of the perceptions that China had held, which is that the United States that non-proliferation was so dear to the United States, and there were so many differences between India and the United States that there would be no meeting point. This sort of argument fell apart. And consequently, from that point on, their anxiety increased. Now, here, one point I do bring in is that there has always been a sense in China about not placing India as an important country in its own right. And now, interestingly, of course, if you look at the history of China's foreign policy, it is China that leaned decisively one way or another to leverage the advantage of a bigger power. These are Mao's own words, leaning to one side. That is what he did in 1950 to leverage Soviet power when he faced a possible US regime change effort. And that's exactly what China did in the 70s when they leaned towards the United States to defeat the Soviet Union. On the other hand, in the case of India, they, however, attributed India always as an adjunct to somebody, as a lackey of somebody. And I think this, therefore, had a bearing when the Indo-US relationship began to evolve in 2008. My own sense is that they never really gave any space to India's arguments, that there were intrinsic foreign policy and national security requirements, as well as domestic requirements, which, for instance, required an Indo-Pacific policy, and therefore an improvement of relations with the United States, whether this was in terms of coastal connectivity, exploiting the economic zone, the exclusive economic zone, preserving the peace and stability in the northern Indian Ocean, where there was a significant movement of Indian cargo and energy. The attribution was essentially by China was essentially that India was veering towards the United States, and that the obvious reason must be the containment of China. And to some extent, it has to be admitted that India's own biases in terms of looking at every Chinese policy with suspicion might have also fed into the Chinese narrative that, you know, this was inevitable because this is the way India looked at China. So these were the three areas from which I looked. And the conclusion I drew was that there was an identity perception on both sides, of course, but perhaps to a greater extent on the Chinese side, because they did not seem to place India in their foreign policy in a position where they might be able to anticipate reactions. They were perhaps caught by surprise by subsequent Indian reactions. And this fed into a further misperception that the reactions were only because India thought that somebody else, some other major power or powers were watching our back. Now, this identity perception, of course, needs to be resolved because it leads eventually to mistrust and distrust, and then to attaching motives to every action that each party takes. And perhaps the events of 2020 provide an opportunity for that. It is a watershed in many ways, not least because two countries which were fond of telling the international community at large that they had managed a disputed border and that not a single fatality had occurred on each side, of course, went out of the window. But also because what happened certainly changed public perception about China in India. I can't speak for the Chinese, but certainly in India, the overall sense before 2020 of a relatively benign China, which had to be admired for its economic successes and for its ability to pull a very, very substantial number of people out of poverty and into the middle class. This has been overshadowed by a sense that China is an adversary, that it is inimical to India, that it doesn't want India to progress, that it is willing to bully India when we are down and out facing a pandemic. And therefore, I think a reset in the relationship is no longer possible. I think it has to be rebuilt, albeit by using some of the bricks of the previous relationship. But it has to be rebuilt. And my sense is it will be rebuilt properly only if at the top level, identity misperceptions are resolved. And it is also my conviction that both leaders are mature. They have had an opportunity to know each other, they understand each other. And therefore, if they resolve to meet and remove misperceptions, there's certainly an opportunity to do that. And once they do that, we have a political, a set of political people, whether it is on our side, the External Affairs Minister, the Defense Minister, the National Security Advisor, or their counterparts, who have the necessary skill and ability to handle it, to take it forward from there. And I ended the paper essentially just by suggesting a few issues that both sides need to look at, without in any sense talking about the precise way forward, because I think that's a policy function of the government. But very briefly, my points were that unless both sides take the boundary issue seriously, we might lead to a further miscalculation. I'm a little discouraged by the Chinese foreign minister's statement about putting the boundary question in its proper place. In my view, the proper place is now fairly close to the center of the relationship. And while nobody is saying that the relationship is hostage to it, but it is centered to that relationship. Also, we need to rebuild peace and tranquility. And here I do want to flag that it is a little odd that the party which complains that the other party is unremittingly nibbling away I would think, be the party interested in clarifying the line of actual control, but is in fact the party which is not really interested in doing so, or certainly is delaying that process. That needs to be relooked at. Now, if armed coexistence, as some of our very distinguished and prominent academic experts and intellectuals and former government officials have said, is going to be the norm, then definition of the LAC is important. But one last issue I did flag was the trade deficit. Certainly, whenever I would talk to the Chinese, I felt that they did not understand that the matter of the trade deficit had evolved from a purely question of statistics to a political problem in India. And that it could not be business as usual. Now, I think the incidents of 2020 hopefully remove that misperception on the Chinese side. The misperception that India will simply open its market and sit back and will not focus on developing its own economy the way that China did. And I concluded by saying that this is an opportunity, but we could very easily slip into a further downward spiral. And the objective of the paper, Rudra, was to at least start some thinking in our strategic and intellectual community on the way forward. So that in a nutshell is the gist of the working paper. Thank you.
No, thank you so much, sir. And it's certainly done that. There's a huge reception of the paper, and I think it certainly stirred a healthy debate on the future of China. Before I turn to Srinath, sir, if I could just ask you one question is, through the thread of the entire paper, and as well as your introductory remarks, some of the terms that are quite illuminating is its perception, misperception, the failure to read the other. And this loss of understanding seems to be the backbone of the failures that we see today. I was just wondering, as you talked about rebuilding this relationship rather than resetting this relationship, given where India is and given the domestic pressure, as well as the economic arguments vis-a-vis China today, and the fact that the deficit is no longer a matter of elite perception and elite argument, but it's a public argument, do you think we're looking at the road ahead from Galwan as one where we try to bridge the gap in terms of perception and hence move on? Or do we take it as a given that this perception structurally exists and hence move on?
No, I think that I at least believe that there is a possibility to bridge the perception gap. Maybe not entirely, but that process can begin. But my sense is that will happen only when there is, that understanding will develop only at the very top. The way that the Chinese side is structured, it doesn't allow for reasonably frank and open conversations at various levels, unlike what happens when democracies talk to each other. That's a problem that we have to overcome.
Thank you, sir. And if I could turn to Srinath for some of your reflections and thoughts.
Thanks, Rudra. Ambassador Gokhale, first of all, many congratulations on this really excellent paper. I know it's just been released yesterday, but I'd urge all our listeners to read it carefully. I think it repays very close reading. I must say to everyone that one of the things which struck me about this paper is the absolute fair-mindedness with which you have approached the analysis of this relationship. I must say that the manner in which you have, of course, in your official career, been so closely involved with India's foreign policy towards China. But I think the objectivity with which you bring to the sort of paper is truly remarkable, and it's an inspiration for all of us that we have to learn to sort of think about how the other side thinks as well, as much as assuming that our own views are somehow reflective of reality. I really commend everyone to read the papers. Sir, I have very little to add, so to speak, to your analysis on the terms in which you have done. Perhaps, just by way of, provoking a discussion and a little bit of debate, because you said that, we have to still think about what is the way forward and so on. I would suggest that, your framework, which as Rudra also pointed out, is focuses a lot on development of perceptions, how misperceptions on each side can feed on one another. So there can be a negative feedback loop of a certain kind. And that, even despite best attempts at, particularly on the Indian side, it's, trying to sort of reach out to the Chinese and convey our sense of priorities of what is happening, perhaps we've not succeeded as much as we should. And, that clearly is a very important issue. And I might say that, historically, that has always been a problem with China. The misperception question has a long history. But as you rightly point out, in recent times, it has acquired a certain kind of salience, which is very important. But, perceptions, misperceptions are almost by definition subjective. I think it is very important also to look at what the objective circumstances are, and whether then to think about saying, how do we think? And when I say objective circumstances, I'm really thinking about the bigger questions about the distribution of power between countries like China and India, and the broader international system and where we fit in. Now, as you quite rightly point out in your paper, the Chinese, they watch power relationship and disparities quite closely. And at one point in your paper, you also say that there is an overwhelming perception on the Chinese side that whatever might be India's aspirations, perhaps it is not yet built the kind of hard power that is needed in order to be able to realize those aspirations. And which is why the Chinese feel that it is easy to kind of ignore what India's concerns are on various concerns. I think that's a very important point. And, it is that as much as our aspirations, it's our power capabilities which also have to develop. And the reality is that certainly in the last 4 or 5 years, the Indian economy has not been doing very well. It has all kinds of knock-on consequences for how India operates in terms of its strategic posture, how much of military modernization it is able to undertake, and so on. And as you point out, the Chinese have managed to do all of that quite well in the post-2008 period to a certain extent. And that kind of objective disparity of power between India and China is, I think, something that we have to take into account. And which is why, from the Chinese perspective, the most important power relationship, as you say, is with the United States. And India only comes into the calculus in as much as, from the Chinese perspective, it is about whether India can tilt the scales more in favor of the United States and against China. And there, I think it's worth pointing out that, whatever might be our view of the Chinese or whatever might be the Chinese view of themselves, in objective terms, the Chinese are not very well positioned in Asia. They don't have very strong alliance systems. They are up against countries, even leaving aside the United States, I'm talking about Asian countries, which are reasonably strong and capable of holding their own, as India has shown just this past summer, when push comes to shove. And economies which find that they have multiple reasons to work together in order to push back against what China is doing. So from an objective point of view, the Chinese are not at very well positioned. And I think that also adds to their concern about where India might end up weighing or tilting the scales, so to speak. So I think that is one aspect of the story, which I think it's kind of important to bear in mind. And it's not very clear to me that there is very much that we can do in order to change that. Because that's a story which is broadly about bigger trends, which will shift over a period of time. And some of those shifts is already happening. Which is why, if you take something like Quad, I mean, I think, irrespective of whether, the Chinese are responding to the Quad or is the Quad responding to China, the reality is that the Quad is going to constrain China's maritime options in the Indo-Pacific. The Chinese know it and they will not like it. So I think it's best to proceed on some of those kinds of assumptions as well, which is that there are some cases in which we will simply not be able to change Chinese perceptions because the objective realities in some ways are stacked up in a certain sense. Which brings me to my second point, which is that, as you quite rightly point out, I think we have to have a new framework within which to think about the India-China relationship. But this is not just a relationship of two countries which are locked together along a very long disputed border, but also about two countries which are rising and emerging powers. And as with all rising and emerging powers, as their power expands, their conception of their interests also expands. Which is why I think you saw that over the past decade, just as China is very keen on pushing out BRI, India has been very keen on asserting its position as far as the energy is concerned, or about, getting things on Masood Azhar and other things, right? So these are things which, as you rightly say, the Chinese perhaps don't appreciate. But the fact is that it is not very clear to me that we can get the Chinese to appreciate these interests, simply because, in a sense, these rub up against each other. These are the new realities, the objective realities of the situation look to me such that, it's going to be quite difficult to get the Chinese to understand what's happening. The third point, and this is really the last thing that I want to say, is that, I don't want to make it seem as if this is an inexorable story of, two rising powers which have a long disputed border and that they are going to sort of compete with each other, possibly leading to clashes and so on. But what is also striking is that there is, at this point of time, no broader international or, sort of multilateral institutional mechanism in Asia to reconcile these kinds of security challenges. Asia is pretty unique because, it's economically very integrated, but in security terms, extremely fragmented. And as long as that fragmentation and absence of any kind of institutional mechanism for tackling security questions persists at an Asia-wide level, then both India and China are going to believe that they are in a system where self-help, each one for themselves, is the only way forward, which will then automatically lead to more misperception and so on. And I don't see how that sort of broader structural story is getting addressed as well. We have tried things like East Asia Summit in the past, but also just looking at the US-China rivalry itself, it's not very clear to me that that is going to allow the development of some kind of a security architecture within Asia, where we can actually kind of mitigate some of these things. So just to sort of, bring it all together, I would say that, as important as your emphasis on addressing misperceptions and working towards it, which I think we should, irrespective of it, we should also be cognizant of the fact that objectively speaking, it is going to be quite difficult to get over these misperceptions and so on. Not because, they don't understand each other, but at some objective level, our interests and our ambitions do clash. So we, in some ways, as we are thinking for the way forward, I think it's important also to keep that in mind and not to assume that, in some ways, just highest level diplomacy, etc., can solve problems. Perhaps it will help mitigate problems. We should continue in all those things. But at the same time, we have to be mindful of the fact that the Chinese, as you quite rightly say, know and understand the language of power best. And it is important that we also start learning and understanding to speak that language increasingly as we go forward. Let me stop.
Thanks, Srinath. And Ambassador Gokhale, if I could come back to you for any kind of any thoughts that you have on that. And, it connects quite nicely. Michael Crepon has a question that he's put in the box, which is essentially the similar lines that Srinath had, is that on the one hand, there's an identity perception gap, which no doubt needs to be bridged. But on the other hand, there is something to be said about power, ambition, and clashing interests. And I think that kind of dovetails with the points that Srinath had. So if I could just come to you with that first.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Srinath. I think they're very, very, very perceptive observations, and I entirely agree with much of what you said. So the first point you talked of, that is that China understands the reality of the distribution of power in the international system, which is also the question that Michael Crepon asked, is linked with your second question, which is related to scholarship. Now, my own sense is that for about 2 decades after the end of the Cold War, scholarship on India declined very sharply in China. This was because obviously China's interests lay elsewhere, towards the West as well as towards new areas like the Middle East, because they were dependent on oil, towards Korea because that was becoming an active problem, and so on. China had very good scholarship on India and vice versa in the 50s and all the way to the 80s. But in the 90s, there was a definite decline. Now, the lack of scholarship in China, the think tank community or the academic and strategic community is actually a part of the government, although they technically are autonomous, and they have a substantial input in the inputs that go into policy. Although policy formulation is obviously a government function, I would tend to think that they have much greater input than the academic and intellectual community in India has in any direct sense. Now, if the advice that was coming, and I suspect that was the advice that was coming, was based on India of the 1980s and 90s rather than India of 2010, then you were feeding into that perception gap. Now, I do entirely agree with Michael Crepon that, perception is one thing, but the Chinese are masters in assessing the power balance, the power equation. But the Chinese also are very good at long-term thinking. They are now thinking of what happens in 2049. Logically, anybody who had a reasonable understanding of India would surely in China realize that despite the current power gap and possibility of that power gap persisting until 2050, it was nevertheless a question of India also substantially going up in its own weight. I mean, it was moving up in the class of boxing, in the boxing weights class. And therefore, it was important, it should be important for Chinese policy to place India properly. My contention is that I think the placement of India is perhaps not accurate and therefore leads to misperception. This brings me to one other interesting point which I do want to flag here, that we are seeing from 2021 an entirely new effort to reconnect with party history in China. This is an effort being led by President Xi. Now, although there will be greater interest in India, I have no doubt, in the academic and intellectual community of China post-2020, not only because of the LAC incident, but also because our economy is growing, Indo-US relations and so on, will the party's guidance and the reiteration of party history between 1962 or 1949, because Tibet is also an issue in the relationship, again constrain that scholarship. And therefore, the question to my mind is, will the Chinese academic community, even with the fresh intake of people, be able to create the kind of intellectual output which reflects India correctly, or will the party line prevail? That's something worth thinking about. On the last issue of whether there can be a broader institutional mechanism in the Indo-Pacific, I entirely share your view that the current mechanisms are weak, whether they're the East Asia Summit, the ADMM plus, even the ARF. But the question is, where is the problem? To my own sense, the problem lies in the Chinese idea that there must be consensus. And for them, the concept of consensus is the principle of one. If one party doesn't agree, it doesn't matter if the remaining 30, 40, or 15 or 20 parties agree. Now, if that, and that is what is being followed, whether it is India's case in the nuclear supplier group, whether it is, on a number of issues, China uses the principle of consensus to meet the principle of one. If that is the situation, then perhaps there should be a calling out rather of that situation, rather than simply assuming that the Chinese narrative is correct, which is that groups and alliances and partnerships are being formed in the Indo-Pacific, and this does not allow for a security architecture to evolve. Which is why my last point was, and one of the points in the paper was, we need to sit down and have a very frank conversation with China about the Indo-Pacific, about India's interest in the Northern Indian Ocean, where China is not a littoral state, and China's interest in the West Pacific, where it is a littoral state, but where we have fundamental trade and economic interests in the same way that China has in the Northern Indian Ocean.
So if I could just discern from that for a second, from the outside, it seems to me that there are two compelling arguments, though. The one, and here let's talk about the Indo-Pacific for a little while. We've also got a few questions on the Indo-Pacific and the Quad. One is that India needs to do perhaps more to explain to China what its real interests are in the Indo-Pacific and the various geographies around the Indo-Pacific. The second seems to be a very clear argument that perhaps India should use the Indo-Pacific as a strategic accelerator to make sure that it maintains stability with China when it comes to the long and contested border. So keeping that framework in mind, so Suhasini Haidar has a question to say, how do you think the Chinese are going to view the Quad Summit tomorrow? And how do you think these two perceptions kind of work out? Should we be doing more using the Quad, using the Indo-Pacific? And is the rationale for those conglomerations China, or should we be looking beyond that?
Yeah, so Hasini, I think, at least in my mind, one point is clear. The Indo-Pacific vision is not identical to or similar to the Quad. And we must convey to the Chinese side, through the academic community, through the media, and so on, that a conflation of the two would be a strategic misjudgment in my mind. The Quad is a platform of 4 countries, and it could have many more countries, or it could expand on an ad hoc basis. I was just reading before this webinar article written by Evan Fegerbaum for the Carnegie Endowment on Quad in the context of tomorrow's summit. And he argues, for instance, that it should be a core of 4, but on an ad hoc basis, several rotating coalitions could take place. So it's a platform for discussion. And we know that in the Indo-Pacific and in other parts of the world, there are other platforms. In fact, China has 2 quadrilaterals of its own. It has a quadrilateral between Pakistan, Afghanistan, Tajikistan, and China. And it has another one very recently formed during the COVID crisis between Pakistan, Afghanistan, Nepal, and China. Now, are we to impute the same motives to them as they impute to us? Because both these quads are actually contiguous to our boundary or to our border. So my sense is that India's position has been mature. We understood that these were platforms created for certain requirements, which the Chinese or others might have had, provided they are transparent and open, and they respect the international order. India has not, in a sense, reacted negatively or adversely to them. Conversely, the Chinese have reacted to Quad as if it were to be an Asian NATO, when there is no treaty, there is no understanding, there is no structure, there is no secretariat. So the question that begs itself is, what is behind this issue? Now, as far as the Indo-Pacific is concerned, it's an entirely different matter, because that is a vision that India has in the same way that China has the Belt and Road Initiative. True, we have some concerns on the Belt and Road. Equally true, China will have concerns on the Indo-Pacific, but it cannot condemn the whole idea. There are certain fundamental requirements, given the fact that our own trade, for instance, has grown from $100 billion to $800 billion in terms of movement on the seas. That's an 8-fold increase in 20 years. The energy requirements have gone up, have trebled in terms of barrels per day between 2000 and 2016 or 17, which is the latest statistic I was able to see. Now, that being the situation, it's obvious that our maritime interests are going to grow. And those maritime interests will be from roughly in an arc from the Gulf of Aden to the Straits of Malacca. Equally, just as it is important for China to ensure that the sea lanes of communication are open to the Gulf of Aden, it is important for us also to see that the sea lanes of communication are open beyond the Straits of Malacca. My view is that the Taiwan Straits is India's business, not because of politics, but because of business. 40% of India's trade either passes through the Bashi Channel and the Taiwan Straits, or is in and around that area. And of course, a lot of our investment flows from that region, including from China, certainly from Korea, Japan, and other places. So my point is that we have to evolve an understanding where there are core interests involved in the Indian Ocean and in the Western Pacific, but also create an understanding that there are subsidiary interests, which means that simply an Indian warship passing through the South China Sea should not evoke a reaction when we are perfectly acceptable to Chinese warships making port calls in our neighborhood. That's my point.
So, sir, if I can just gently push you on that, is given what you just said, and given that there is a perception gap, what do you think will be the Chinese response to the Quad Summit tomorrow?
Well, the spokesman has been somewhat cautious and said that, all these mechanisms should lead to stability and so on. I think basically Raghavan answered the question where he said that obviously they will be displeased and unhappy. Uh, my sense is that the Chinese side would like to build a certain public opinion about the Quad in the region. And we need to be careful as India not to allow that narrative to build up, because for us, this region is important in terms of India's own relationships with the ASEAN states, for instance, or Korea, Australia, and so on, as well as the individual states in ASEAN. We have stakes in this region. And therefore, for us, the Indo-Pacific vision is one where we see our economic future, our peace and our prosperity linked to this region. Therefore, the narrative that must go forth is that on the Indo-Pacific idea, we are open to discussion with everybody. I think the Prime Minister's statement in Shangri-La was drafted very carefully. And again, here I talk about the perception issue. China was pretty much front and center in that perception when that address was made. And I think that lays out the parameters of our view of the Indo-Pacific. True, there are others which have different visions and they're entitled to it, as China is to her vision. But we must not allow our vision to be conflated with another vision and therefore put down as something which is bellicose, or which will antagonize the region, which will disturb its peace and stability. And I think here, therefore, a frank dialogue is necessary.
Thank you, sir. If I could just bring in Srinath, we've got a range of questions which is more focused on the border and the LAC. So perhaps I could start with Srinath and then come back to Ambassador Gokhale. So Srinath, we have 3 questions. And the first question is what Ambassador Gokhale talked about bringing the border back to the center of the relationship in itself. But Ambassador Rakesh Sood has an interesting question where he says is that back in 2008, when the special representative process was broadened, didn't it at the time dilute the focus on the border in itself? So if the whole idea is to bring the border at the center and the front of the Sino-Indian relationship, did we shoot ourselves in the foot by broadening the scope of the SR dialogue from your perception as somebody who follows the border very carefully? And the second and kind of added question is, we're perhaps only at the beginning stages of the disengagement process. So Srinath, how do you see that working out as we come close to the summer months?
So, Rudy, on the first point, I'll actually be interested in hearing what Ambassador Gokhale has to say, because he was much closer to that, from the Indian side. And
I was trying not to put him on the spot. So,
but I just think it's an interesting question, and it's worth. See, I have a slightly different and a broader take on this question. See, in India, we always tend to assume that, listen, the Chinese are the ones who are not interested in settling the boundary issue. So, I don't think that is historically an accurate statement to make. I think there has never been an Indian government which has also been willing to make the necessary concessions in order to get a border. I don't think the two sides have ever come close to seriously discussing what it will take in order to get such a settlement. Perhaps the closest was in April 1960 when Chow Enlai was here to discuss the Jawaharlal Nehru. I honestly don't think that it's fair to say that, yes, should we put the border issue front and center? I think we need to, in a sense that the longer this issue remains on the table, the more difficult it is going to be. But at the same time, let's also bear in mind that no Indian government, including majority governments or coalition governments, have ever felt that they have the requisite domestic political capital to expend on this particular issue. So I'm not sure that politically it's such a feasible argument to make that we should be serious about solving this boundary, because I don't think the Indian politics works. So that's just my observation. On the de-escalation and that story, obviously it's to the extent that we have reports of the initial steps which have happened along Pangong, so I think it's important. But clearly there are many other places, including Tepsang, which are very important, where the situation continues to be sort of challenging. And I think again, I don't want to sort of get into the weeds of the thing, but if you just step back, I think what has been most striking about what has happened since last summer right up to now is that the Chinese have in some ways demonstrated their capability both to go in and to come out very quickly. Go in with substantial number of forces, deploy, to put pressure, and then come out. Right? I think there are very important lessons that we have to take away from this particular pattern of Chinese capability and intentions and behavior. And we have to start thinking seriously about saying, listen, what is the way in which we can do it without getting locked into a line of control type, long-term, stable deployment, which is not, it's neither possible nor desirable for us. So, but I think we have to take some very important lessons. So I think we'll have to watch this process very carefully and see how exactly disengagement happens. But at every point, remember that whatever be the assurances on which this current disengagement is happening, Chinese capabilities have been demonstrated. And we should not be caught napping a second time in the face of such.
So, sir, can I ask you one question? Do you think we were caught napping this time?
Let me answer first, Rudra. I think the two questions you asked, Srinath, let me talk about them. I mean, I don't want to go into the history of the boundary, and we all know what happened in 1960. But the short point I do want to make is that after 1980, from the 80s onwards, the initiatives to at least look for a settlement of the boundary question came from India. For instance, Rajiv Gandhi's visit, Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi's visit in December 1988 led to the initiative called the Joint Working Group on the India-China boundary question. Similarly, the visit of Prime Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee in 2003 led to the formation of the special representatives on the India-China boundary question. These initiatives were from the Indian side. So again, there was some hope when the agreement on political parameters and guiding principles was signed in April 2005 under the government of Dr. Manmohan Singh. So I would say that certainly the initiative might give you an indicator of who might be less willing. I'm not saying who might be more willing, but who might be less willing. The other indicator to me would be the mirror problem, which is the LAC. Now, there surely, I think successive governments of India have been very clear about the importance of clarifying the LAC. And all the successor governments after 1988 have taken steps to suggest ways to do so. And we have drawn a blank. So again, I come back to the comment I made. Why would a party which felt that the other party was nibbling away at its territory be reluctant to clarify a line? It should be the party which nibbles, which is reluctant to clarify the line, not the one being nibbled at. So without making any categoric statement, I think this might give an indication where the larger problem lies or where the mindset lies. On the disengagement issue, I have nothing to add to what Srinath said. But I think that we should understand that the outcome in February is important. Diplomacy is also functions under constraints. And both Michael Crepon and Srinath Raghavan talked of the power differential. So I think that the fact that status quo ante is or has been restored or is being restored, I haven't actually followed the process of disengagement in the Panpung Lake area or the Panpung Tso area, and that the commanders are meant to talk about other areas is a positive sign, and I think we have to allow that process to unfold. The more important point which Srinath said, and I completely agree, is that will disengagement lead to de-escalation? And presumably we are aware that the Chinese have not only demonstrated these capabilities, but they have perhaps augmented them in the rear guard. They may have pulled back from the front, but in a depth of 25 or 50 or 100 kilometers, certainly according to media, I see that there is an augmentation and not a de-escalation.
So, sir, just very quickly, and we've got a bunch of questions on the border itself, but I'll just cut through the grass on those. Do you think if in the next 6 to 8 months we begin to witness a degree of de-escalation, so not just disengagement, do you think that there is some amount of appetite on the Chinese side to return to talk to the border, or not at all? I mean, anecdotally, I remember when Srinath and I were there a couple of times in 2019 talking to officials, and this was right after Doklam and Wuhan. We were categorically told is actually we're not interested in talking about the border. We're interested about economics, geopolitics, etc. So, do you see that process starting up again from a Chinese perspective?
My sense, Rudra, is that the messages that the government of India has given in the last 2 or 3 months are very clear, which is that the matter has to be settled in Eastern Ladakh. And the boundary issue or the line of actual control will be an important aspect, if not front and center in the relationship. And I think this message has been reinforced at a political level and at a bureaucratic level, and perhaps at the military level also. So I think this is the Chinese may not indicate that they take the messages, but they would certainly listen to them. Now the question is how that process of de-escalation proceeds and disengagement takes place. And then the question is, again, the trust has to be rebuilt to move forward, whether it is on illicit clarification or on the settlement of the boundary. And this is again where I come to the fact that once you deal with the immediate problem at hand, the misperception issue or perception issue, even if it means correcting the misperception on the basis of the power balance that Michael or Srinath talked about, has to be discussed. It cannot simply be a resumption at the bureaucratic level, for instance, of the talks on the boundary issue or the LC clarification. There has to be a larger understanding. And I think that's important. And my sense is that both parties have the capability and the maturity to do that. Of course, I can't speak to political will.
So just on that, and I'll come back to Srinath as well. On this matter of trust and how do you cement that trust at the higher level, you suggested that the principles meet. But Ambassador Suresh Prakash and Aman Thakur have a similar question. Their question is that, but the principles did meet. They met twice in the recent past. The whole idea was to use the informal summits to engineer trust, to bridge the gap, for instance. But that process clearly didn't work. So I'm just coming back to the question of, do you think that either informal summit or a principles kind of meeting is the way forward?
First, I think it's too early to say that. The process, two meetings don't make a long process. Secondly, I think we all know that when the Chinese engage in summitry, you don't get outcomes or solutions. That's not the Chinese way of doing business. And I think, therefore, that the intention of our government was to allow for a certain discussion to take place, to build understanding, hopefully to build trust, but with no expectation that a big announcement was going to come at the end of the meeting. And that is precisely what happened. Now, I think that we have to allow that process to move forward again. That, again, as I said, depends on both governments and whether they have the appetite for it. But we must recall that similar summit meetings between the Soviets and the Americans, for instance, or between the Chinese and the Americans went on for many years before an outcome came. Whether it was a nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation, or in the case of America and China, a number of false starts in various capitals of the world before that so-called secret visit from Islamabad to Beijing by Dr. Kissinger. So my sense is that if we expect that two conversations, maybe even stretching over a few hours on each occasion, is going to lead to an alignment, I think we would be expecting too much. My own sense is that the point I want to make is I think that the leaderships on both sides are mature enough. They have the capacity and ability to talk through these issues. And this might be a process, a way out of the quagmire. That's my point.
Srinath, if I can just turn to you with your historian's hat on, do you think what you're seeing at the moment is the onset, as Ambassador Gokhale hinted, of, say, the 1972 US-China moment or the 1989 Gorbachev-China moment, where the major powers sat down and understood that they're going to have to redefine the paradigms of that relationship, where mistrust has to be understood but not necessarily bridged, and structurally changing the way stability can be found between two warring parties. Do you think we're on the onset of that process today? Or is it too early?
I would say we are not, for the simple reason that, as I said, my own reading is that the objectively speaking, the conflict of interest is pretty strong between India and China. It is, of course, in our common interest to ensure that we do not see a repetition of the kinds of events that have happened last summer along the line of actual control, and to move towards a relationship which is more stable and predictable. But it is going to be very difficult. So I would say that, in the first instance, let's not hike our hope. But at the same time, I'd fully endorse what Ambassador Gokhale said. I think in India, we have a sense that, summitry is somehow theater, right? I mean, this is just leaders coming together, all this stuff is happening, great breakthroughs are expected at all times. It is not that way. And you know it as well as I do. I mean, it took several meetings before, Reagan and Gorbachev met in Reykjavik and almost agreed on a nuclear zero, right? I mean, anything, if you have the right context, things can happen. Of course, that did not mean that you still got the nuclear zero, but still a breakthrough was made. And I think the most important thing for India and China, particularly, is to understand that, listen, that the current model in which we have been trying to manage our differences perhaps has not yielded benefits, and to search for a way out. That is exactly what, as I see, Ambassador Gokhale is saying. And there is no ready-made formula out there. I mean, if you put it as a formula, I think it will sound very banal. You will say things like, we'll cooperate and compete. It doesn't mean anything very much. But in concrete terms, I think there is actually no other alternative but to sit down even for longer periods and try and see what is the way through. Is there an alternative that can emerge? Now, of course, we may say that, listen, in the back of all this, what has happened, how much can we trust the Chinese and so on. And as I said myself, that yes, you have to be mindful of their capabilities and the fact that they take capabilities very seriously. So I think as much as anything, it's our domestic economic recovery, our kind of ability to accrete our power, which will kind of help us. But at the same time, I don't think there is any other alternative but to say that, listen, we have to look for a way forward, because it is neither in China's and certainly not in India's interest to be locked in this kind of a posture along the LAC and a broader kind of a rivalry and a spat. And more than anything else, I think, for instance, it's very important that, India, in the first instance, at least manages to convince the Chinese that we have some very significant interests beyond the LAC, in the subcontinent, for instance, where India's primacy is being sort of questioned in a number of different ways. And I'm putting it somewhat bluntly, but let me just put it there. Where I think it's impossible to assume that the any Indian government is going to sit tight and watch while its position is kind of being probed at multiple fronts in the subcontinent. I don't think that's going to happen, and I think the Chinese have to understand these things just as much as we are trying to understand what are the kinds of issue areas and this thing where they want something. So as I see it, I think we have to go forward. We have to sort of engage in more dialogue, as Ambassador Gokhale says. There is no alternative.
Thanks, Srinath. And Ambassador Gokhale, if I could just bring to you, I'm mindful of the clock, but the point that Srinath made about the subcontinent dovetails with some of the questions that we have, which is, so the first question is that should we have just been a little bit more mindful of Xi Jinping's South Asia outreach in the early part of the 2010s, in around 2012, 13, for instance? And does that mean that the question is, should we have done more by way of India's neighbors, where traditionally there's been a strong, but sometimes a difficult, or a lot of the times a difficult relationship? So if you could take that, and then I've got one slightly more tactical question that I'll kind of end with.
Yeah, Srinath, we are living in a globalized world in the 21st century. And while, of course, we wring our hands about the Chinese in our backyard, the question I pose is, who has a backyard anymore? 200 years after the Monroe Doctrine was established, today, who is in Venezuela, and who is in Cuba, and who is in other parts of Latin America? The Russians and the Chinese. In the Ukraine, which was a backyard for Tsarist Russia and the Soviet Union, you have the European Union and NATO there. In North Korea, which was a backyard for the Chinese, you have the Americans and the Japanese there. And unimaginably, in the South Pacific, which is just understood to be an Australian backyard, you have the Chinese all over the place. So my sense is we need to look at Chinese presence in South Asia, of course, with concern, but not simply as a zero-sum game. Everybody is in everybody's backyard. And the question is of protecting our strategic influence. Now, what should be of concern is the recent translation of the study done by the Academy of Military Sciences of the PLA, which has effectively said that the strategic defensive perimeter of China has moved from its homeland, which is the Himalayas, Tibet on the southwest, to the Indian Ocean, northern Indian Ocean. In other words, that brings all of South Asia within China's defensive parameter. And to my mind, while our media, of course, focused largely on the India chapter of that book, this was the central point of that study, that that China was redefining its strategic defensive parameter to the northern Indian Ocean and the Western Pacific, which meant that whether we like it or not, the Chinese see this as legitimate part of their defense perimeter and will move in many ways. Now, it behoves us to tackle that situation. And I have no doubt that the government of India is well aware of this situation and will tackle it. But we need to move out of the question that the way of tackling it is, to put it crudely, throw the Chinese out. Because in the globalized world, I'm afraid that's not going to happen.
Okay, so, and just one last question. One of the pillars that supported the argument in your paper was India's relationship with the United States and the perception change that may have taken place on the Chinese side because of this kind of structural partnership. How do you see the near future and the Biden administration's approach to China? There's an important meeting of principals coming up in Alaska next week. At least from the outside, it seems that the Biden administration's approach seems to be coercion via engagement rather than coercion via obstruction, which was the kind of Pompeo and Trump perspective. And so part A of the question is, how do you see the US-China relationship work out in the near future? B, what effects is that likely to have on us, if any?
Yeah, so of course, the coercion via engagement is in fact what the White House National Security Interim Directive also virtually said, although not in so many words, but that was the broad thrust of that. Now, it's still too early to say as to how it will play out on the ground. What we are seeing is, on the one hand, Quad meeting taking place, and almost immediately after that, the discussions between the foreign policy principles of the United States and China. And we've seen this earlier in the telephone conversations also, this sort of balancing. Of course, I can well understand that the United States is trying to rebuild trust in its allies, which was badly affected or seriously damaged when the previous administration was there. And at the same time needs to rebuild a relationship with China. And therefore, I can understand this hedging. But it is too early to say how this will eventually play out. What one can say with at least some degree of certainty is that the China has now come as in front and center in the US national security perspective as an adversary of some kind. And therefore, US policy will change in that regard. But how much it will change, whether we go back to the Trump era or whether the engagement is the engagement of the Obama era, which was perhaps more engagement than coercion, even though the pivot was announced, is something that I really can't speak to at this stage. I think it's too early in the Biden administration. Maybe Srinath has a view.
Srinath, do you have a view?
No, not really. I mean, I have nothing to add.
Okay. With that, we're right on the clock and we don't want to give too much away. If I could please encourage our viewers and our listeners and others, this is perhaps the most important paper that has been written on China in a very, very long time. If I may say, please read the paper, please engage with the paper. You can engage in many different forms. But sir, if I could just thank you on all our behalfs for, I think, stirring a debate, a much needed debate in the country on what a rebuild with China might actually look like, and what were the forces of perception, misperception, and what were the contours of trust and mistrust that perhaps inform the way in which we find ourselves today. So thank you so very much, sir, for the paper, for taking the time this evening. Srinath, thank you for joining us. And to everybody else, have a good evening, and we'll be back soon with India and the world on yet another topic that is yet to be defined in the near future. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks.
Okay.